I'm the Centerville-Washington History Coordinator of the Speaker Series, and tonight I'd like to welcome General John Allen, U.S. Marine Corps retired. He's going to speak about the war in Ukraine and the future of geopolitics. General Allen currently serves as the 8th President of the Brookings Institution, and he's retired U.S. Marine Corps 4-star General and former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Prior to his role at Brookings, Allen served as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East security and as a special presidential envoy to the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL. General Allen is the first Marine to command the theater of war, as well as the first Marine to be named Commandant of Midshipmen for the U.S. Naval Academy. And also, as a kind of a side issue here, General Allen has a lot of ancestors in the Centerville-Washington Township area. And he's been back here several times doing research on his ancestors. Am I correct on that, General Allen? Can you hear me?
I can. Yes. There's Allen's buried in all the cemeteries around Centerville.
Oh, great. Great.
So we're really proud of our Ohio heritage, and but in particular the Centerville-Washington Township heritage. We're very, very proud of that.
Good. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Susan, and Susan Melville, and she will be the moderator for tonight's session. All right? We've got about an hour, so we'll listen to all your good words and stories. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Okay, so now the audience can hear me, and hopefully you can hear me as well. So I'm Susan Melville. I work for Centerville-Washington History, and it's so nice to be with you today and this audience. So I have some questions first, and then we'll take audience questions after.
Sure.
So the first one is, many of us have closely followed the ongoing war in Ukraine. What is the current state of the conflict, and where might it be heading in the coming weeks?
Well, I think everybody's very interested in that right now. Just as a little background, we're doing a lot of work. My organization is doing a lot of work doing analysis on the conflict in general, but also providing advice into the government, whether it's the White House itself, or the National Security Council, or Department of State, or Defense, or the Intel community. We're spending a lot of time working this issue, and it's obviously one of the big issues of our day. And just briefly on my family heritage, we have been in Centerville. My ancestor, Mason Allen, my direct ancestor, was, I think, born there. We believe he was. He was born there around 1802. So we've been there a long time. We're very, very proud of our Centerville heritage. Look, this war has brought us to a point where the security architecture that we had been very used to in the post-Cold War period has been upset in many ways. Of course, NATO has grown over the years from its earliest number, which was around 16 countries or so, to 30 today, and it has grown to the east. And the Russians, of course, in whatever form they have taken, whether it was a czar or whether it was a Soviet chairman, or whether it's today's president of the Russian Republic, the Russians, or the Rus, have always wanted to have a substantial buffer zone around the area of their direct governance to prevent their being invaded. And whether the invaders were Mongols coming from the east or the Teutonic Knights coming from the west, the Rus, the Russians, have been overrun multiple times through their long history, and they have a real bias towards having something called the near abroad, which is a series of buffer states around them. Ukraine is one of those states, the near abroad. And as Ukraine became more aligned with the West, Europe and the United States, and in particular made noises about joining the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, that was unacceptable in Moscow. It was unacceptable to Vladimir Putin. It was unacceptable to the tradition, the Russian tradition of controlling and influencing the near abroad. And that began a whole series of long-term maneuvers in the latter part of 2021. It went into the winter, the early part of 2022. And then on February 24th, after Zelensky, for all intents and purposes, refused to give in to the intimidation, the invasion started. Now, the Russians invaded along 4 different axes, 4 different lines of invasion. The one in particular, the main effort, was intended to come straight down the Dnieper River and easily sweep aside the Ukrainian army. Did not expect to have any opposition from the Ukrainian people. And Putin anticipated that the government in Kyiv would simply either collapse or surrender, or Zelensky would flee. And none of those things came to pass. His intelligence was just awful in many ways. The Ukrainian army fought. He had not anticipated how good it had become. It had been trained for years by NATO. It had been trained for years by the British. Ukrainian forces served under my command in Afghanistan. They were very good. And they were very much a Western military. So the Ukrainian army didn't give in. And there's a tendency, and I've been to Ukraine and I've been down to the Donbass, which is where the fighting has been. There's a real tendency for Ukrainians to organize locally, and that also was something he had not anticipated. He thought the people would accept the invading army as Russians, as the big brothers of Ukraine, or if you will, a Slavic country liberating a Slavic country, or a Slavic people. And that wasn't true either. And the Ukrainian population, largely the male population, because the law required that Ukrainian men remain in the country to fight, the civilian population rose up against the Russian army. And then, of course, Zelensky didn't give in. And what's happened is after those initial 4 coordinated thrusts, they were badly coordinated, failed to accomplish their objectives, the Ukrainian army, as is often the case, received the initial blow of the Russian forces, absorbed that blow, were pushed back until the point where they stopped the forward momentum of the Russian forces, regained their footing, began to put to use the weapons that we gave to them. And those weren't weapons just from the United States, they were weapons from all over NATO. We can talk about that if you like. And now the momentum of battle is turning. It's turning on behalf of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians completely defeated the main thrust down the river towards Kyiv. It has just defeated the secondary thrust, which was against Kharkiv, and Ukrainian forces yesterday consolidated on the Russian border after having completely expelled the Russian army from the secondary thrust. The third thrust was intended to be a pincer movement to encircle the eastern part of the Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainians, seeing that, attacked the northern jaw that was seeking to encircle them and destroy them, and blunted that pincer movement, that encirclement, and now that has failed. The Russians still hold a significant amount of Ukrainian territory. The southernmost thrust is the only one that's really had any success, and it has uncovered the land route into Crimea. You'll remember that the Russians took Crimea in 2014, and it has thrusted to the west, if you will, in the direction of Odessa. Now, nobody's going to let the Russians take Odessa, but the Russian intent was to take everything from Kiev all the way around to Odessa, severing Ukraine's access to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And so, in many respects, the Russian invasion has stalled. It has been defeated on 2 of the main axes, partially defeated on a third axis. And they're taking very heavy casualties. We think that as many as 25% of the initial forces that were committed have either been destroyed or neutralized. Enormous material losses. our weapons turned out to be quite effective against the Russian tanks, and we think that they have lost as many as 900 Russian tanks. Now, multiply that times 3 or 4, depending on the tank, in terms of tank crews, and that's a lot of casualties, and that's just amongst the tanks. And then the Russians never established air dominance. They have a huge air force, and they never coordinated control of the airspace with the ground forces, something that comes very naturally to Western forces and has come pretty naturally to the Ukrainians by virtue of our training. And the Ukrainians actually can achieve air superiority locally in places around Ukraine, punish the Russian troops, and then disperse their air assets to keep them from being destroyed. So they've done pretty well. Now, where are we now? We've heard Putin reformulate his campaign objective now several times. Initially, it was, I'm going to come in with a lightning strike, take out the Ukrainian government, pull it back into my sphere of influence, occupy key aspects of Ukraine with Russian troops, and that's it. I'm going to do it so fast NATO can't even react, the United States can't react. But of course, that didn't happen. So now you're hearing him say that we're going to take the Donbass, the region of Luhansk, a major province in the north, and Donetsk in the south, and then connect it to Crimea. He's actually started to redefine that into a smaller set of objectives as well. Meanwhile, Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who I think all of us admire enormously, has begun to redefine his objectives, which is he intends to eject the Russians out of Ukraine. Now, we'll see if that happens. I think where this is going to end up is Ukraine ultimately being willing to accept where the boundary was between the Russian separatist forces and Ukraine on the 23rd of February, which in essence returns almost all of Ukraine to its original state, leaving some part in the hands of the Russians. In truth, I think in the end, we're going to have to give Putin something because he's got some options that we don't really want to think about if he believes that the outcome of this is a total obvious defeat, which could in fact ultimately unhorse him as the president. And that's a problem. So I think we're beginning to get to a point where we can think about a ceasefire, but I don't think we yet can foresee what a peace agreement would look like. So we may have a frozen conflict with a ceasefire, a line of contact between Ukrainian and Russian forces, and that'll sit there for a while until we can get to the table to have a conversation. Now, you know, we've lived with frozen conflicts before. In the Middle East, there are several frozen conflicts, and you know, several score thousand American troops have been on the Korean Peninsula since 1953, and that's still a war. We only have an armistice and a demilitarized zone, a line of contact. So we've seen these go on for some time, and I don't think anybody right now can see the contours of what the end of the conflict will look like, but I think it looks pretty much how I just described it. Peace will take a while to determine whether they'll ever sign an agreement with the Russians or not. It's hard to say. Meanwhile, lots of things are changing in the world as a result of this. Sorry to go on so long.
No, that's perfect. I think it's so fascinating how you describe it, and it helps me understand so much more. So I appreciate that. You did mention support, and maybe we'll get back to that later, but let me go on to the next question, which I think is equally interesting. What have we learned about Russia through this conflict, and what of 21st century warfare more generally?
Sure. You know, when the first tanks turned to the south out of Belarus, when the 24th rolled around, we were all watching for this to happen, and we thought this was going to actually happen pretty quickly. We just had been watching the Russians now for a number of years. We were actually quite surprised at how incompetent they are. And I mean it. They're awful. And what we had seen for the last couple of decades is Vladimir Putin creating a modern and a modernized army, modernized military, with some pretty good equipment. But there's this great military theoretician by the name of Clausewitz. And he said that there's two real components to war. There's the character of war, which is the technical, mechanical part, the things, the warfare of things, technology. And then there's the nature of war. That's the human dimension. And what we had done in the West for a number of years, for frankly, well more than a decade, actually about 20 years, had been intensively training the human resources of the Ukrainian military. So for example, and your audience would recognize this immediately because they're Americans and many probably served or have experience with Dayton and the Air Force. One of the things that makes our military so good, and militaries like ours around the world, is the presence of something in our rank called the non-commissioned officer, the NCO. You know, officers give the orders, and frankly, nothing happens unless the non-commissioned officers make it happen. And we concentrated intentionally with the Ukrainian army to take it from being a post-Soviet army, where NCOs really don't exist. And almost all of anything that happens because of officers, but none of those officers will take initiative, because if you fail, the consequences of failure in the Russian army or the Soviet army were pretty awful. So there's very little initiative. The leadership necessary to execute orders doesn't really exist in the Russian army, but we had worked very hard. The British in particular had worked for many years to help to build up the non-commissioned officer corps. So when a Russian military that had been in the field in the dead of winter, and it's really cold there, I'm telling you, it's really cold there. It gets cold in Ohio, it really gets cold in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia. They'd been in the field for months and already lacking in leadership, already lacking in training. When they went across the border and they ran into a Western trained military that began to slam the lead elements of their armored forces, and the troops frankly would not get out of their armored vehicles because it was too cold and because they weren't trained to fight as infantry, not very well. And they were going up against good infantry who were used to fighting in the cold and had very good weapons that we had given them. So this ended up being a battle of human character. And the Russians didn't show up, and they paid a price for it. The Ukrainians were all about it. And they were going to make the Russians pay for every inch of Ukraine that they took. And I think we all remember on the news these heartbreaking pictures of young Ukrainian fathers or brothers or sons embracing their families and their wives and children as they were passed safely across the NATO frontier into Poland or Hungary or Slovakia or Romania. And then those youngsters, those young men, turned around and went straight back into the country to fight. That's human nature. And this became a war of human character as opposed to a war of technology. Now, we gave the Ukrainians some pretty good technology, and we're still pushing that technology across the border. And the good thing is, in many respects, they know how to use it. And we've been pulling Ukrainians out of Ukraine from the very moment that this started, and have been training them on our systems, anticipating we would provide these systems to them. So they go back and they train Ukrainians, and then the systems arrive, and then they put them into action. So a technologically advanced military in the hands of human resources that either can't fight or won't fight or don't know how to fight, you're watching it unfold before your very eyes.
Yeah, and it's all about motivation as well. You know, that if you're protecting your family and your country, there is a greater motivation than just who's telling you what to do.
Yep, well said. Exactly right.
Looking more globally, many have noted the closer ties between Russia and China. What does this conflict teach us about China's role in geopolitics and competition with the United States?
That's a great question. It's an important question. For those in your audience that haven't read it, I would strongly recommend, although you'll be sorry when you're done, that you read the 4 February joint statement between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the president of China. And that statement, this goes to your question about the increasing closeness of the two countries. That statement really very clearly spelled out in very much a manifesto, if you will, where Russia and China see themselves going. And where they see themselves going is to be in direct competition and ultimately to surpass the West in terms of global influence. The Chinese in particular believe that ultimately they must, to survive, must replace the United States as the dominant force on the planet. Now it's very interesting. I lead 2 delegations, 2 bilateral delegations, U.S. delegations, in conversations with the Chinese. One of them is on the future of our relationship in the 21st century U.S.-China relations. And the other one is on the employment of artificial intelligence in military systems in the context of how AI and all of the associated capabilities of AI can be brought to bear on the battlefield. And it's a very interesting conversation. But I held both of those conversations now, the most recent meetings with the Chinese after the invasion occurred. And the first thing the Chinese will tell you is remember the joint statement is the 4th of February, they invaded the 24th. The first thing they'll tell you is, we didn't know that Vladimir Putin was going to invade Ukraine. Well, that's a lie. But I don't think they had any idea that this was going to end up this way. Because the Chinese, and I've spoken already now, extended conversation with the Chinese ambassador here in Washington, the Chinese are really bending themselves into pretzel, trying to remain in some manner true to their agreement with the Russians, but disassociating themselves with the horrific outcome of this war. Now, simply apart from the battle damage that always happens in conflicts like this, what we have discovered, of course, is as the Ukrainians have liberated population centers that were occupied by the Russians, we have discovered incredible, inhumane treatment of the Ukrainian people, violating the laws of armed conflict, violating international humanitarian law, in some ways beginning to inch up to being describable as genocide. And the Chinese are trying very hard to disassociate themselves with those outcomes. And what they do is they blame the United States. They blame the US and they blame NATO for having forced the Russians to defend themselves by invading Ukraine. I mean, the logic is tortuous, but they've got the talking points. And you just listen to them talk, and then you begin to ask them, what about the United States forced the Russians to, for example, flatten an entire city? What about the United States forced the Russians to, and I hate even you saying this term in public, to weaponize rape routinely in the occupation of Ukrainian cities? What about the United States caused them to ultimately shoot Ukrainian prisoners? Explain that, how that's our fault. Explain to me how that's NATO's fault. And of course, the Chinese have no capacity to explain that. So they're really in a very difficult situation now. Now, there's another thing about this as well, and this is this place called Taiwan, which we have the United States has a very close relationship with. And I was involved for many years, 3 years, being many years in Washington, it's an eternity. I was responsible for the Taiwan portfolio, among other things, during the Bush administration, Bush 43. So I was responsible for the arming of the Taiwan military and the training and the major strategic exercises. And what the Chinese have just seen, they have just seen what they would have considered a really modernized, well-equipped, well-prepared military fought to a standstill, and then locally and increasingly regionally defeated by a military that by all logic shouldn't have been able to do that to a first world superpower. And so they're taking notice of this. And they're taking notice of the fact that the Taiwans, they're called Taiwans, that the fact that the Taiwans are, if anything, far better trained, far longer associated with the United States, and strategically far better connected to us than even Ukraine is to NATO or to the United States. So this has really given the Chinese in their region pause for thought as well. And I'll say one final thing. And I've said this to the Chinese, and they really hate it. Almost every single person in the Chinese military comes from an era of what was known as the one-child policy. And I think the audience knows about this. And this was for many years in order to keep the size of the population under control so that the Chinese economy had the capacity to support it. All families in China could only have one child. And if you had a second, you were going to be taxed pretty exorbitantly or even charged under the law. So virtually all the military serving on active duty in the Chinese military is from a one-child family. And just imagine the effect on a society if it took very heavy casualties in a failed amphibious assault across the Taiwan Straits to try to take Taiwan and then didn't do it. It took thousands of casualties. For every one Chinese service member who was killed in action, 4 families disappeared. That's it. There's no heredity. So the Chinese have got to be thinking about that as well. And at this moment, when President Xi hopes in this fall with the 20th Party Congress, hopes to be proclaimed president for life, he's got to be very careful about putting China in a position where it is held accountable for the Russian invasion, or put in a position where, if he's not careful and something untoward occurs and hostilities break out in East Asia, a one-child military that now clearly its capabilities are perhaps in doubt, given how the Russians did, tangles with Taiwan or tangles with the United States. So the Chinese are paying very close attention to this right now.
I had not even considered the one-child policy in a military, that is the end of your family line. How,
that's it.
Yeah, how frightening. And that does change behaviors, I'm sure, when that is a policy. At a grand strategic level, where do you see geopolitics and great power competition heading? Is the invasion of Ukraine just the beginning or a blip on the radar, especially given the seeming failure of the Russian military so far?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. If again, your audience takes the time at some point soon and reads the 4 February manifesto, you'll see that the Russians and the Chinese proposed to redefine democracy on their own terms, not our terms, theirs. Human rights on their own terms. And by the way, they say democracy and human rights should be subject to unique characteristics of history and culture. So, okay, you can have your democracy, but it's going to be Russian democracy, or it's going to be Chinese democracy. And guess what that is? The rule of law, they will uniquely define the rule of law, and the idea of sovereignty, territorial integrity, all of these things, they're going to define going forward. Doesn't make any difference what we think, they're going to define it. And the size of the Chinese economy, the capacity of them to have outsized influence on many of the economies around the world, they believe that their capabilities combined will give them the capacity at some point in the context of great power competition to fragment the West. This is before Ukraine. Fragment the West, take advantage of the, at least in Moscow and Beijing, the appearance that America is in trouble in its democracy, and begin in small and incremental ways to replace our influence in the world. Just yesterday, Adolf Scholz, the new president in Germany, who really has taken Germany to an incredible level of commitment on Ukraine in a very short time. Had a phone call with Xi Jinping, and the Chinese are checking in a lot with the Europeans right now, just to sense the heat, how angry the Europeans are over Ukraine, and are the Chinese going to get some of this later? And he made an interesting point. It shouldn't be a surprise to no one, but he made the point that the Europeans should pursue his term, and some of the European countries have used this as well, strategic autonomy. Meaning, you Europeans need to have your own autonomous identification, your own identity apart from the United States, because in the end, the United States isn't good for you. We, China, we in our economic relations, we are good for you. So let's go ahead and pursue a bilateral relationship that is pragmatic and respectful of each other's sovereignty. We'll have strong economic ties. But in the end, you ought to be autonomous from the United States. And the Chinese then want to seek. I don't think they want to go to war with us for all kinds of reasons. I just explained some of them. But they believe that time is on their side. And watching the state of American democracy today, which they believe is in very serious trouble, whether it is or not is for us probably to decide. But they believe it. And they think that this is their moment. Now, that was right up to the 23rd of February. Now they're seeing American leadership that they haven't seen in a long time. American leadership that brought Europe together in ways we've not seen in a long time. NATO is very soundly united. We have Sweden and Finland petitioning to come in. We have East Asian democracies joining us in this coalition. And that's exactly the kind of American leadership that the Chinese don't want to see. This is why they're going to try to create, in the context of great power competition, this sense that in the end, many of the countries in the world, their interests are better served by an association with China than with an erratic United States. Their terms, not mine. That's why India has stayed out of this in many respects. The second largest country in the world, highly technologically advanced, a democracy. But the Indians, and I've spent a lot of time with them as well, the Indians are sort of in a pickle here because much of their military is based upon Russian equipment. So they're learning a lot about what they purchased from the Russians, turning out to be not so good, and they're redefining their military needs by potentially buying American equipment or Western equipment. But they also have no great love for the Chinese. So the United States has been very careful about leaning on the Indians here. The Indians have been very outspoken about the Russian aggression and the brutality of the Russian forces, but haven't joined in some of the major sanctions. And I think we're okay with that for now, because in the end, India will be with us. They certainly won't be with the Chinese, and they're really mad at the Russians and at this point now. So great power competition still is going to happen. And the Chinese are going to work very, very hard to disassociate themselves with the ugliest parts of this war without throwing the Russians under the bus, but still recognizing they desire to replace the United States as the principal influence in the globe today.
Wonderful. You mentioned Finland and Sweden. Any response to any more information about that, or the response from the Russian president?
Yeah, at this juncture, I'm just checking to see somebody's trying to get a hold of me over one of these issues. Sweden and Finland have, all the Nordic countries, the 5 Nordic countries, have always been very close as a group of states. So it's Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Denmark and Iceland and Norway are already in NATO. Sweden and Finland had for many years exercised with NATO, and much of their equipment is what we call NATO standard. So ammunition that the Danes might fire will work in weapons that the Finns carry and the Swedes carry. And they're technologically quite advanced, and they are great cold weather warriors. The Soviets, now Russians, the Soviets will remember the Winter War of 1939-40, where the Soviet army ran into the Finnish ski troops, in November, December, the depth of the Finnish winter, and paid with tens of thousands of killed. Many of them killed in battle, many thousands killed by the cold. They remember that. So up to this point, the actual NATO frontier with Russia was relatively small, just a couple hundred miles. If Finland comes in, it's going to add another 800, almost 840 miles to the direct NATO-Russian border. Now the Russians have been, and Putin in particular, but the Russians in general have been pretty unhappy about this. And I've had the chance to speak with the Finnish leadership a couple of times. The Finnish people, Swedish people, were not real keen on joining NATO, but they were very keen on having an association with NATO, and they thought that was fine. But the war itself really turned everything around, and where 25 to 30% of the Finns had favorable impressions about joining NATO, now well over 70% do. I think it's 76% today. So the Finns have petitioned to come in, as have the Swedes. Now here's the problem. There's 30 countries in NATO, and for anyone to be admitted into NATO, all 30 countries have to vote them in. In walks President Erdogan of Turkey, and the Swedes and the Finns, Swedes in particular, and they're coming in as a matched set. The two of them aren't, one isn't going to come in without the other, so they're coming in as a matched set. The Swedes have given asylum to Kurds from Turkey who are associated with a Kurdish terrorist group in Turkey called the PKK, the People's Workers' Party. Now, I dealt with some of those guys in Syria when we were attempting to defeat the Islamic State, and we were using our Rangers and Delta Force guys to work with Kurdish, what the Turk called terrorists, but they really weren't, to defeat the Islamic State in northern Syria. But Erdogan has said until the Swedes extradite the Kurdish terrorists back to Turkey, he will not vote to permit the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO. So here we go. These two great countries, two dear friends of the United States, have now committed themselves. And in the eyes of Putin, committing yourself is as bad as joining. They have committed themselves to joining NATO, and Erdogan in Turkey says until the Swedes give up the PKK members, he's not going to vote them in. I think in the end he probably will, but he's going to extract a real pound of flesh out of NATO, out of the EU, probably out of the States. One of the things that he believes is that some of the members in Sweden that perpetrated the coup against him years ago, put differently, there are people living in Sweden who were part of the responsibility for attempting to overthrow Erdogan. And he wants them. He wants them back. The person he says is fully responsible for the coup actually lives in Pennsylvania. So, this is a very twisted and weird world we live in. We still get along generally pretty well with the Turks, and Erdogan is Erdogan. But we're stuck right now. We're stuck. NATO wants them all in. I thought Jens Stoltenberg, who's the Secretary General of NATO, he said, we're going to get him right in. I thought he'd already worked this, frankly, with Erdogan. That's why he was saying publicly, we'll vote him right in. Erdogan is a man of timing. He sees exactly that this is his moment to extract some real concessions out of Europe and the United States and out of those Nordic countries. We'll see if he gets them. We'll find out.
Wow, it's fascinating. I learned so much. Thank you so much for going into that.
Sure.
So beyond military...
That's called painful detail.
Well, it's definitely not on my radar, all of those political details, so thank you. So beyond military conflict, what will most define future geopolitics and competition? Economics, technology, politics, etc.
That's the question. I think it's on everyone's mind now. My own view, even before the 24th of February, is that technology increasingly will define geopolitical relationships and or geopolitics in general, but geostrategic relationships. The advent of supercomputing and artificial intelligence has changed a lot. There isn't anybody in the audience tonight that won't get home from this event without having touched or having been touched by or having been influenced between their seat and their home by something that has some aspect of artificial intelligence associated with it. And it's increasing. My car, I had the same car, bought the same car 3 different times over 9 years. The first time I bought it, I could barely get a radio station. Now it's a rolling computer for all intents and purposes, and it updates itself going down the road, and it's just, the march of technology is incredible for our good. But in many respects, technology is going to define our values unless we define how technology is used. Technology is neutral. It's neutral. How it is used for the good of humankind, or for the surveillance of a population, or the suppression or the oppression of a population, is a function of the values of the country or the leadership that puts it to use. And so I think what we will see is that as technology changes, it's not just changing, the rate of change is just head spinning. As technology continues to change before our very eyes, the values that we espouse as a great democracy, and we're still a great democracy, and our allies, who are not exactly like us as democracies, but pretty much, but our values are very similar. We're going to see that our values, accelerated and magnified by technology, will be at the heart, in many respects, of the future of geopolitics and geostrategic relationships. And where we found ourselves pretty fragmented in the West because we didn't have anything really that united our sense that we have to bring our values together in the future because of a potential strategic competitor. Now that's far clearer to us today with Ukraine and the 4 February manifesto than it ever was before. The question isn't whether that's clear to us. The question is, can we hang together long enough that we can create amongst the democracies a habit of cooperation based on our values, where we can leverage our superior technology for our own defense, for the improvement of the quality of life of our own people, and not necessarily to wage war upon our opponents, but to make sure the opponents understand, you screw with the United States, you are in very serious trouble. And you're in very serious trouble from space, through cyber, through information. And then if you tangle with the Marines, you know, look, it's going to be a really bad day for you. So I think technology, based on strong, robust economies, will, in many respects, define geopolitics and geostrategic relationships. Now, the one thing that's coming at us like a freight train, and we still haven't done enough, and I don't know that we can, is the change in climate. I get that question a lot. You know, what's the greatest threat the United States faces? I'm on the board of visitors of the Naval Academy, and I graduated from there almost 50 years ago. And when I go back to meet the Academy, what I'm now faced with is that the Academy's campus is underwater about 10 times a year now. That's a problem. And that's just one place. As hurricanes gain in strength because of the warming sea surfaces, as they move slower, as they're wetter, as they drive higher sea levels farther inland with salt water that ruins farmland, as fire seasons elongate every year to what will become a fire year instead of a fire season, as the storms in the center part of our country become worse, and it's like that all around the world, we're faced with some real challenges. And I don't really care whether we want to debate whether it's man-made or not. Bottom line is it's happening. And we're going to have to think about how we can manage and mitigate these changes, ultimately to the benefit of our entire population, not just that part of our population that's wealthy enough to be able to move out of the areas of potential hazard. So I'll stop there.
No, that's a great point to bring up. I actually have one last question that I just was curious about is, we read today that Ukraine surrenders Mariupol. What's the significance of Mariupol to the Russian-Ukrainian war?
It removed the last obstacle between that area in eastern Ukraine called the Donbass and the exit out of Crimea. So in essence, from the Donbass in a contiguous, constant land bridge, it connects to Crimea and permits the Russian control of an arc of territory from Luhansk in the north all the way around to, I don't recall the name of the river, I apologize. The river that is the barrier that keeps the Russians from crossing to attack Odessa. And Odessa is a very famous ancient city. It was, one of the great centers of Jewish culture in the 15 and 1600s or earlier than that. I mean, it's really an iconic city, and the Russians are pummeling it now with long-range rocket artillery. But I think very clearly the Ukrainians are going to fight to keep that from happening. Now that Mariupol is in the hands of the Russians, that creates a constant, contiguous land bridge, if you will, from the north, the entire coast of the Sea of Azov, which was what Mariupol was on, across the Ukrainian isthmus, and then some part of the Black Sea coast.
Thank you so much for all of your explanations to these questions. We have some audience questions now, and we will pass the microphone to them.
All right, is there any questions out there in the audience? All right, I see one hand back here. I'll come back to you.
Can you provide insight into your opinion? Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry if I need to speak up.
Barely, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Can you provide insight into your opinion on the alignment between the autocratic countries and democratic countries, and how this is going to affect, our geopolitical sphere of influence now? Because we have some autocratic
I got
leaders.
most of it. Can someone just repeat it, please?
Yeah, right now, I'll give it back to Susan.
Uh-oh.
Paraphrase if you would.
I don't know, I wasn't listening, I'm sorry.
No, it was a good question. I just didn't get all the words. I'm
No,
sorry.
just come on up.
Okay.
There we go.
Can you provide insight into your opinion on how autocratic countries and democratic countries are going to align coming forward within our geopolitical, future? I feel like we're in two camps where it used to be, communist versus democracy, but now I'm seeing this autocratic tension and how we're going to align with people in the Middle East, countries in the Middle East, or governments that are autocratic. How do we pull them into the democratic camp versus, the autocratic camp?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's I think it's in the minds of a lot of people going forward. I think there are countries around the world that we have to deal with. It doesn't mean we have to like them. It doesn't mean we have to espouse their values. There are some countries we have to defend ourselves from. I spent a lot of time in the desert fighting Al-Qaeda, and I spent a lot of time in the desert fighting the Taliban and in the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the Islamic State. And there were countries that we actually have relationships with that supported them. And so we've got to grip our own values as best we can. But there will be some countries that are either geostrategically located on the planet or who have resources that we, in a pragmatic way, are going to have to deal with in some form or another. During the very worst moments of the Cold War with the Soviets, we still had the capacity to negotiate arms treaties with them to prevent ourselves from being blown up in a nuclear, thermonuclear exchange. During the most difficult moments of the era of Mao Zedong, we still could have conversations with the Chinese, even though we kept them at arm's length, even though there wasn't a thing about them that we wanted to emulate or embrace. But because of the place on the globe, or the size of their population, or the resources they control. We have to have some capacity to deal with them. And I've always believed that even our enemies, we should talk to. Not because I like them, not because I want to get to like them, but because when you don't talk to them, then people make decisions to do things that could put you on a path that's irretrievable in terms of escalation. For example, I was in the six-party talks for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I sat right next to the North Korean delegation. And as much as my skin crawled by sitting next to the North Koreans, knowing what they did to their people every single day, and knowing that they would kill me in a second if they had the chance, just like I would have probably them, we still had to talk, because we still had to deal on issues associated with denuclearization. Now, we know that that didn't work, but it didn't work because we weren't talking. We at least talked. And it slowed their production of nuclear weapons for a while. When we stopped talking, guess what they did? They built an ICBM that can reach the entire United States except for Miami, and they weaponized the nuclear devices to put it on the nose cone. So your question's really important. How does a nation of laws, how does a nation that espouses human rights and a commitment to equality, as are enshrined in our Constitution, how does a nation like us deal with countries like that? And the answer is by embracing our own values, by espousing our values to those countries that want to be like us and bringing them along with us, but also recognizing there's some pretty bad actors out there. And if we don't talk to them, we might end up having to fight them for sure. And if we don't have to fight them and we can keep them at arm's length and contain them, that's probably not a bad option too. Great question.
Thank you so much. Always talk. All right, we have another question here.
I forget the name of
Hold it closer to your mouth.
I forget the name of the Chinese where they're funding these monumental projects in Africa and around the world where the countries can't afford to do it themselves, but with the alliance, how is that affecting China's growth?
You're talking about something called the Belt and Road Initiative.
Correct, yes.
Yep. I'll say several things about it. Number one, the Chinese have recognized that their model, it's called authoritarian capitalism, that their model is actually pretty attractive around the world to countries that are not committed to human rights the way we are and equality, etc. And those typically, because your question's a really good one, typically many of those countries that are willing to accept these Chinese infrastructure projects, and they're mostly all infrastructure projects, port facilities, bridges, airports, public utilities, etc. Those decisions aren't really made on behalf of the people of that country. They're made on behalf of the strongman who's leading it. And by the way, they're all strongmen. There aren't any countries out there, illiberals or authoritarian states, until Kim Jong-un's sister takes over soon, that are led by women. But the point is that a couple things. The Chinese have suddenly realized a couple of things. One is, it isn't going as well as they thought it was going to go in terms of these countries falling prey to something called debt trap diplomacy. They accept the Chinese money. They go into enormous debt to the Chinese. They find themselves trapped economically by the debt that they have to the Chinese. Sri Lanka lost its principal port facility. Piraeus in Greece is now basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese. Trieste and Genoa in Italy, the Italians are really regretting the arrangement they made with the Chinese. And more these countries recognize that if you sign on to an infrastructure project out of the Belt and Road Initiative, you better be very, very careful. The problem is that we in the West haven't created an alternative. I have a very close friend who's a president. She's now a former president, but she was a president of a country in Central Europe. And she desperately wanted to build a bridge, needed a bridge for traffic and that sort of thing across another sliver of land from another country. She wanted to put a bridge over it so she didn't have to pass through multiple border positions. And she couldn't get any money out of the EU. She couldn't get any money bilaterally out of the West. She couldn't get any money out of Europe or out of America. So she went to the Chinese because she needed to build that bridge and couldn't get financing anywhere else. But increasingly, there are countries in the world that have seen that this isn't working out very well. And if we were smart, we would use this moment, and the 42 countries that have joined us to sanction the Russians, we would use this moment to create the kind of resources necessary for those countries that need help in development to reach out to us for that development money and that construction, instead of having the logical alternative to this point, which are the Chinese. By the way, the Chinese economy is not in trouble. Chinese are always in pretty good shape, but it's the zero tolerance of COVID has really slowed the economy down. It's not growing at the rate that they would have wanted, and the expenses that the Chinese have been paying in Africa, which they have cut back those expenses pretty significantly, and the unwillingness of sectors of the globe to be unwilling to accept the Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure is not going the way the Chinese had thought. And Xi Jinping's probably going to scale that back pretty dramatically. This is our moment. If we were smart, we would take advantage of this for development purposes in the developing world. Take real advantage of this moment. Great question.
John, we got one more question here, and we'll finish this up, this session, as soon as the question's answered.
This has been very helpful. Thank you for being here tonight, sir. With the Chinese buildup in the South China Sea, how effective today is the U.S. Navy in countering that buildup, especially with the artificial bases they've set up there? Thank you.
Yeah, we have this term flashpoints, and you all know what the term flashpoint means, I'm sure. And these are points on the globe where something can happen very quickly, where escalation can spin out of control very quickly. And I worry a lot about the South China Sea. The Chinese have established an illegal claim to much of the South China Sea. A number of allies, a number of our partners. We have 5 treaty allies in East Asia, 5 countries that we will go to war to defend because we signed treaties with them: South Korea, Japan, Thailand, the Philippines, and Australia. Thailand and Philippines claim the same waters as do the Chinese. We have a new friend in that area as well, and I would never have imagined it. As I said, I'm getting gray on top. I was 42 years in the service, and I was in the Navy before I became a Marine. I was in the Navy during the worst part of Vietnam. But one of our best friends right now in East Asia is Vietnam. They also claim a big chunk of that that water, as does Taiwan. So we have multiple conflicting claims, and the Chinese decided to put a stake in the ground, so to speak, by creating ground, by building artificial islands. And initially they said, oh, you don't have to worry about it, we're not going to fortify them. We're not even going to build them very big. So they built them pretty big, and then they fortified them, put airstrips on most of them, and now put in missile defense systems. There's also something that operates in the South China Sea called the Chinese Maritime Militia. And the Chinese Maritime Militia is like a completely unorganized, and I'm using this term, and I don't want anyone to be offended by it, an unorganized Coast Guard with a little C and a little G. No one is like our Coast Guard. No one on the planet is like ours. It's an incredibly effective entity. But the Chinese use it to guard the coasts, this maritime militia, of these islands. And they're irregular forces. They're not part of the People's Liberation Army Navy, the plan. And they have sometimes actually tried to ram some of our ships of the 7th Fleet. Now, under the Trump administration, he basically said, you do this to us again, we're going to sink you right on the spot. that got everybody's attention pretty quickly. And I think that if this were to happen now, we would probably defend ourselves. But your point is really important, and that is the Chinese have seen that if they can push our Navy out away from the coast and away from the South China Sea, using anti-area and area denial weapons, in other words, long-range, precision-guided, artificially intelligent missiles with very high-yield warheads to attack our shipping at long range, they can keep us away from the coast, and they can really complicate our capacity to operate through the South China Sea. Now, we happen to be a pretty good Navy, pretty good. We've got some cards up our sleeves in terms of technology that gives us still quite an advantage if the time comes. We don't want to get into that fight though, because I think that fight is going to be pretty hard. And the one thing I've told the Chinese when we have this conversation is, you guys think that if this fighting starts and you begin to inflict casualties on us, that it's going to be locally controlled, locally contained. I'm here to tell you, the term that you'll hear the U.S. military use is go downtown. We will go downtown to wherever the source of those missiles are coming off the Chinese mainland to neutralize them if they are attacking us at sea. So they need to be thinking about that. Our United States Navy, our great United States Navy, and our Air Force too, spends a lot of time on freedom of navigation operations. Flying through the Chinese air exclusionary zones, air defense information zones, it's called ADIZ. We intentionally fly the Air Force straight through those all the time. The Chinese demand that if you fly through that airspace, you have to report to the Chinese. We don't. We're going to tell you, you don't own that airspace. We're going to show you you don't by flying through it. And we do the same thing about the sea space in the South China Sea. And those fun exercises, freedom of navigation exercises, is where elements of the 7th Fleet just sail through the South China Sea. And the Chinese think that we're intentionally provocative, and the response to them is, the United States Navy, part of its whole identity has been when potentates and pirates and dictators and tyrants attempt to take the sea space away. In other words, the space over which the commerce plies its trade to support our economy and our economy of our allies, you can't do that. We're not going to let you do that. The United States isn't going to let you do that. And so freedom of navigation equals freedom of commerce. And so long as the Chinese don't attempt to interfere with commerce through the South China Sea, we're going to be okay. But we don't like what's developed there. And those Chinese maritime militia forces, I've told them before, that's a flashpoint. You guys better get those people under control, because if you want to see an inadvertent fight break out, have one of them attempt to ram one of our destroyers or interfere with others of our shipping or our commerce. And you won't like the outcome. You just won't. And why do we have to have that problem? We don't need to have that problem. So your point's really important. South China Sea is a flashpoint, and we've got to be very careful. They got to be very careful.
General Allen, I think we've run out of time. I appreciate you being here today. Centerville-Washington History appreciates you being on this Zoom session, and I think our audience has learned a lot tonight.
Well, let me say how sorry I am I'm not among my fellow Buckeyes. You know, my DNA is Ohioan, I think, although I was born in Virginia, but a little Army base right down the road, by the way. But I hope the next time, if I ever have the great honor to come back to Centerville and Washington Township, I have the chance to see you all and to thank you personally for
We certainly
keeping
would
alive
love
the
to.
heritage of our family, all of us.
Yes, we would certainly welcome that. Thank you again, appreciate it. And I guess we're done for this session here tonight. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Have a great night. Everyone be well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.